the Great Stock Market Crash, one of the most notorious events in the early 1900s. The stock market crash of 1929 was easily one of the worst declines in U.S. history and ruined the lives of millions. Overnight, people's businesses and life savings were easily lost as if they weren't even there. Now, as you can imagine, this definitely took a toll on all the American people, and the nation began to fall into a massive panic and depression. So what exactly caused the widespread of depression throughout the country? Well, I guess I could assume a couple of things: deflation, unemployment, banking panics, and a massive increase in poverty and homelessness. That's right, not much to be happy about, huh? And that's not even the worst part. This thing lasted for 10 years. Eventually, lots of people actually found ways to make a little bit of money, doing things such as catching and selling fish or selling newspapers on the corners, were just a couple ways that people were able to make some cash. Now, although they made some money, many were not so fortunate, and people started to lose their homes. With a huge flux in homelessness, people began to congregate together and create shelters for themselves and their families. These shelters became known as Hooversvilles. Hoovervilles housed a variety of people and were mainly located around the edges and cities. Now, people began to look to the government for help, and when this ultimately failed, President Hoover was blamed for the terrible economic and social conditions, thus making the name Hoovervilles. The government finally decided to step in and created the Holly Smooth Tariff of 1930. Now, in retrospect, this tariff was actually a great idea. It would support the U.S. farmers who had been ravaged by the Depression and hopefully help restore some normality to society. But in reality, it's increased around 900 import tariffs, anywhere from 40 to 48%, which means it actually kind of worsened their situation. In fact, it did them so much disservice that many people today believe that it worsened the Great Depression as a whole, and even led to the start of World War II. Speaking of war and military, the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army was a massive gathering of World War I veterans that gathered in Washington, D.C. in protest of bonus payment as wartime vets. And this is not just a protest about plastic straws. No, we're talking 25,000 World War I vets with their families demanding a bonus payment for their wartime services so that the damage done by the Great Depression can be somewhat alleviated. I don't know about you, but if I saw 25,000 angry soldiers wanting more money for fighting in a war, I wouldn't want to be the person that tells them no. But surprisingly, they did not get what they wanted. Fearing that things would escalate, President Hoover sent a regiment of the army into the city and forced the Bonus Army to flee empty-handed. But the idea of financial support from the government was not totally forgotten and led to the emergence of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So what exactly did it do? Well, to be honest, nothing really. And although the Reconstruction Finance Corporation intended to have a high impact, it ended up being a so-called self-defeating agency and was really viewed as just a relief program for big businesses. Which leaves it to probably one of the biggest people of this time and quite possibly one of the greatest presidents in the history of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt. President Roosevelt easily won over the hearts of the American people. He not only asserted that he would help out the poorest of the poor, but also spoke of this New Deal for the American people. Now, this New Deal was not just an event, but it refers to the series of programs and policies enacted by President Roosevelt to try and fight the Great Depression. It was known particularly for its focus on relief, recovery, and reform of the country's financial system. Now, whether or not the New Deal was completely and utterly successful is unknown, but it definitely helped the situation a lot. And although it did not end the Great Depression, it was successful in the sense that it had restored the public's confidence and created new programs that brought relief to the American people. And not only that these programs set up a precedent for the federal government to play a key role in economic and social affairs of the country itself. Roosevelt, however, knew he could not make such an important decision by himself, so he would constantly consult his closest advisors to help him make the next step into moving the nation forward. Almost like football coaches on the sideline that tell the quarterback what to run next. This close group of advisors became known as Roosevelt's Brain Trust. This group not only assisted him in his presidential campaign of 1932, but were prized for their expertise in certain fields. As Roosevelt came into office, the term 100 days became relatively popular. Now, this referred to the first 100 days of a politician's presidency, and because of the severity of the Great Depression, people began to wonder how Roosevelt was going to do. And as promised, Roosevelt got right to it. His main goal was to increase the employment and set up a support system for the poor. With the emergence of the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, around $500 million was spent on necessities such as soup kitchens, blankets, nursery schools, and even employment schemes. That brings me to the Banking Relief Act. In 1933, Roosevelt passed the Emergency Banking Act, which ordered a bank holiday and essentially closed the banks on certain days. Whoever thought that in a time where money was scarce, you'd close banks? But, it actually did help. The purpose of this was so that on those holidays, the federal government would be able to regulate the large sectors of the financial sector. And this was only the start of Roosevelt's New Deal plans. First New Deal programs such as the NRA and CCC were just a few that Roosevelt created to help combat the harsh effects of the Great Depression. The NRA, and no, not the NRA that you're thinking about, actually stands for the National Recovery Administration. And the purpose of it was to eliminate so-called cutthroat competition by bringing industry, labor, and government together to create codes of fair practices and set prices. And although people hoped that the NRA would be able to reform the economy and recover with full employment, that was not the case, and it actually did quite the contrary compared to a similar program, the CCC. Also known as the Civilian Conservation Corps, this extremely successful program fought unemployment rates by putting hundreds of thousands of men to work on environmental conservation projects. And although it did not last long, the effects left behind, such as roads, bridges, and buildings, still stood. The Second New Deal included programs that would even further aid the American people. The SSA, for example, provided Social Security and a system of old age benefits for a multitude of people such as workers, the blind, physically handicapped, and many more. The SSA is and has been one of the most successful and effective programs in the nation. Similarly, the WPA continues to benefit Americans to this day, and it employs millions of job seekers to carry out public work such as the construction of buildings. As people began to pull out of the Great Depression, deficit spending started to come into play. Deficit spending basically meant that people in America were in debt, and that basically they spent much more than what they earned. In an attempt to understand the Great Depression more, John Maynard Keynes developed something called Keynesian economics, consisting on the ideas that a deficiency in demand would be the primary cause of a recession, and that in an economic downturn, unemployment can be a major result. Basically, Keynesian economics was a theory that total spending in the economy would create better results for output and inflation. Now, if you have a basic knowledge of American history, you know that the Indians or Native Americans were not always treated the best. In fact, in their past, they have been seen as savages, and some were even moved from their native lands. Now, it is because of the past that makes the Indian Reorganization Act so important. The purpose of this act was to decrease federal control and increase Indian self-government and responsibility. And although it doesn't seem like much, it was a huge step in the right direction especially for the Indians. Along with the Indian Reorganization Act came many other groundbreaking first-time things. Take Frances Perkins. As the first woman appointed to the U.S. cabinet, she not only was the longest serving in that position, but also established a number of important acts, such as the Social Security and Fair Labor Standard Acts. Similarly, the end of the Great Depression was filled with a bunch of crazy changes. I mean, let's be honest, I think all of these changes were nonetheless necessary, but in the case of Butler versus the United States, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress's power to lay taxes is not limited, and that they have the authority to tax and spend for the general welfare of the U.S. This ultimately benefited the country, as Congress was now able to help in the final stages of leaving the Great Depression. However, the intent of continuously improving the country continued, especially under Roosevelt, and he proposed a plan to expand the Supreme Court. The plan could have easily expanded the Supreme Court to as many as 15 judges. Although this does not seem like a huge deal, people became outraged and accused Roosevelt of trying to pack the court, thus neutralizing the Supreme Court justices to his New Deal. This essentially made Roosevelt lose much of his popularity, but ultimately made little impact to him. When we think of the Great Depression, I think that we ultimately think of these pictures. That's right, these infamous photos that just captivate you into the era of the Great Depression. Now, without even being there, these photos just show you the absolute hardship and struggle that past Americans had to live through. I'm sure you're familiar with the migrant mother photo. Yep, that's the one. Easily the most memorable photo from the Great Depression. Well, you can thank Dorothea Lange for these photos, an American documentary photographer and photojournalist. Dorothea captured one of the darkest times in U.S. history in the form of photography. And without her, imagining what the Great Depression looked like would be much harder.